Hi, welcome everybody. And today we're going to be talking about Miriam's well, which is one of the topics in our parsha. We're going to see how it, in a sense, was the undoing of Moshe Rabbeinu, which didn't allow him to enter into the land of Israel. And we're going to tie it into education, and not just education in the general sense, but also education in the sense of how we learn, how all of us learn, and what the meaning of rebellion is, and how we should treat rebellion, how we should treat people who are adolescents. That you don't actually have to be an adolescent in age. You can be an adolescent in your approach to things. So we'll see a lot of, I think, very interesting topics that have all to do in the end with Miriam's well. Okay, so let's start here. Let me just fix my screen a tiny bit here and get it all set up. Okay. Okay, I'm going to share the screen so that we can see a few verses. There are two separate events in our parsha that at first glance they seem to be two separate events, but slowly as you read it more and more carefully, you begin to understand that they're actually related one to another. And they both have to do with water. Water is actually mentioned more than twice. I think it's mentioned 4, even 5 times in this parsha. So there's a lot of water in it. But specifically, these two events that we're going to look at are actually even very close in the parsha, even though stuff happens in between. So it sort of diverts our attention. So we may not notice that they're really related to one another. So let's start reading and see what we're talking about. I'm going to share the screen. Okay. This might be a little small. Bigger. Okay. I hope you can read this, that it's big enough. Okay. The Israelites arrived in a body at the wilderness of Tzin on the first new moon, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Miriam died there and was buried there. So we have in our parsha actually the death of both Aaron and Miriam. So Miriam passes away first, and you have to remember this is happening at the very end of the 40 years in the wilderness. They're about to enter the land of Israel now. Actually, 38 years pass just before Miriam passes away. We hear about the red heifer and how to purify somebody who's come in touch with a severe form of impurity. And then Miriam dies. And so Miriam died there and was buried there. A little bit later, we hear about Aaron, Moshe's brother, also passing away. And one of the things that's not mentioned in the parsha is that Miriam was 127 years old when she passed away. Aaron was 123. She was 127. If you remember, 127 was the age that Sarah passed away at. And it's also the number of states that Achashverosh and Esther ruled over, 127. But we're going to get back to this hopefully later, to this interesting fact. So Miriam died there and was buried there. The community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, "If only we had perished when our brothers perished at the instance of the Lord." Moses and Aaron came away from the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. The presence of God appeared to them. And God spoke to Moses, saying, "You and your brother Aaron take the rod," meaning the staff that Moshe was carrying around since the time that he had taken the Jewish people out of Egypt, take the rod and assemble the community, and before their very eyes order the rock to yield its water. Thus you shall produce water for them from the rock and provide drink for the congregation and their beasts. So Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he had commanded him, and Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he said to them, "Listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock?" And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his staff. Out came copious water, and the community and their livestock drank. But God said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them." A terrible, terrible punishment. Moses was living his whole life in order to get to the land of Israel. And now he's not going to be allowed in. Those are the waters of Meribah. Meribah means a quarrel, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, through which he affirmed his sanctity. All this is in Numbers 20, it's in our Parsha. But the second episode is in the next chapter, and again, it doesn't seem to be related to first, and it's another story about water. It's another story about drinking. So the Torah says like this, and from there to Be'er, they came to a place called Be'er. Be'er means a well, which is the well where God said to Moses, "Assemble the people that I may give them water." Then Israel sang this song, "Spring up, O well, sing to it, the well which the chieftains dug, which the nobles of the people started with maces, with their own staffs, and from Midbar to Matana, from Matana to Nachliel, from Nachliel to Bamot, and from Bamot to the valley that is in the country of Moab, at the peak of Pisgah, overlooking the wasteland." This is in Numbers 21. Now, as we said, there is a connection between these two. It may not be immediately apparent, but the first verse here, which is the well where God said to Moses, "Assemble the people that I may give them water," suggests that this is actually related to the previous episode. That Moses assembled the people and he brought them water. It's not clear from the previous it's kind of weirdly, it's in my face. It's not clear entirely that when Moses brought the water out of the rock, that the result was a well. But the idea that they were assembled and he brought out water, that seems to be talking about the same thing. It becomes even more clear when we realize that this is not the first time that Moses brought water out of a rock. If you remember, in the book of Exodus, just after they had left the Red Sea, they were in the desert of Sin, it's called, Sin. Very similar to this desert. This wilderness is called Tzin, with a tzaddik. And that wilderness was called Sin, with a samich. So when you write it in English, you transliterate it. So one is like a T-Z-I-N, and the other one is S-I-N. So there, in the first days after they had left Egypt, just as they had left the Red Sea, we find a similar story. From the wilderness of Sin, the whole Israelite community continued by stages as God would command. They encamped at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses, "Give us water to drink," they said. And Moses replied to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you try," meaning, why do you contest the word of God? But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up from Egypt to kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" Moses cried out to God, saying, "What shall I do with this people? Before long, they shall be stoning me." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pass before the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take along the staff with which you struck the Nile and set out. I will be standing there before you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will issue from it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. The place was named Massah and Meribah. Notice it's the same name, Merivah, really, it's with a V. Because the Israelites quarreled and because they tried God, saying, is God present among us or not? This is in Exodus 17. So we've got these two stories, one at the beginning of the 40 years, one at the end of the 40 years, and a related story about some song of the well. So obviously something is going on here. And the way that the sages solve all of this, and they turned it into one story, is that this is all related to what we call Miriam's well. And what's the idea behind Miriam's well? The idea is very simple, that Miriam's well was the name given to this rock that traveled with them, not traveled in the sense of moved, but wherever they were, a rock became the site of a well from which they drank in the wilderness. And this went on for all 40 years of their travels in the wilderness. Let's see how the sages put this all together. They say like this. So the well, which this is from a very, very early source, so Tosefta on Sukkah, on the tractate of Sukkah, in chapter 3. So the well which was with Israel in the wilderness was like a rock, which was like a sieve, a kebara. It's a very interesting word in and of itself. It's not a, it turns out, interestingly, that on Facebook, where I'm broadcasting the class to also, I sound like I'm underwater. So that's very fitting for this class. Maybe I can get a sieve, get something to receive, and you can hear me better. But in any case, so the rock was like a sieve and was oozing out and rising as from the mouth of this flask, traveling with them up the mountains and going down with them to the valleys. Wherever Israel encamped, it encamped, meaning this rock or the well, encamped opposite them before the door of the tabernacle. The princes of Israel with their slaves surrounded it and said over it this song, "Spring up, O well, sing ye unto it." Then the waters bubbled forth and rose on high like a pillar, and everyone drew out the step of his tribe and family, as it is said, the well which the princes dug, which the nobles of the people delved, which with the scepter and with their staves, and from Atanat to Nachliel, and from Nachliel to Bamot. It's just quoting the song, going round every camp of God. So basically what they did was, according to this description, they took their staffs and they sort of marked where the water would go. They made a path for the water. And so this water reached everybody's tents, and it separated between the tribes, and it was like a river there, going round every camp of God and watering all of the Yeshimon, meaning the prairie, the wilderness, and it made mighty streams, as it is said, and streams overflowed, and they were sitting in skiffs going from place to place, as it is written, they ran in the dry places like a river. If Israel went up on the right, it would come down on the right. If on the left, it would come down on the left. The waters which emptied themselves from it became a great river, pouring themselves into the Mediterranean and bringing thence all the precious things of the world. As it is said, these 40 years, God, Havaya, has been with you. You have lacked nothing. We'll get back to this idea of the 40 years in a moment. So we have this very interesting description. In the first year when they came out of Egypt, Moses had to strike the rock and bring waters out. But from then on, it seems that the way that the waters came out, whenever they moved, was just by singing. They sang this song to the well, they sang this song to the waters, and the waters gushed forth. They went up like a pillar, it says. The question then becomes, what happened in the 40th year? The answer, the reason this is called Miriam's well is because when she passed away, they learned that this well, even though Miriam was not involved apparently, this well was in her merit. As the Talmud says in Tractate Ta'anit, that there were 3 miracles that accompanied them in the wilderness. The manna came down in the merit of Moses. The clouds of glory were in the merit of Aaron, and the well, the water that followed them, was in the merit of Miriam. So when Miriam passed away, they suddenly learned that she had been the cause, she had been the reason for the waters that they had enjoyed all these 40 years. But since the waters had disappeared, meaning, it's very interesting, that as long as Miriam was alive, it was enough to sink to the waters and they went up. But the moment that Miriam was gone, Moses had to restart the well. They came to him and they asked him for water. So he turns to a God and God tells him, what you did 40 years ago, do now. Take your staff and bring the waters out. But the big mistake was that 40 years ago, Moses had struck the rock and then the waters came out. This time, he only needed to speak. But instead, he struck the rock twice until the waters came out. And that was reason enough, as it were, for Moses not to be allowed into the land of Israel. And this begs a tremendous question. Okay, he made a mistake. It wasn't clear. What should he have done? Should he have spoken to it, struck it? The last time, 40 years ago, he struck it. Why not do it the same way this time? In any case, for such a minor mistake, Moses can't go into the land of Israel? That doesn't make very much sense. So to understand what's going on here and how this is all related to psychology and how we can understand this is related to education, to our relationship to teenagers, our relationship to young people, and so on. I understand that there's a problem with the, I don't know why, there's apparently a problem with the Facebook, so I'm sorry, I'm turning it off. Welcome everybody, and today we're going to be talking about Miriam's well. That's what Facebook does. One of the topics in our part. Okay, so to understand this, we have to look at water in a much more general sense than the way we usually do. And we really need to look at it as part of what is known as the water cycle. The water cycle means, and let me make this a lot bigger. I hope you can see this. The water cycle is one of the most ancient connections that humanity has with nature. And what does the water cycle mean? It means, and anybody can decipher this, just spending a little bit of time thinking about it, that the waters from the ocean evaporate. Anybody who's ever played with water knows that water evaporates. And we know that under extreme heat from the sun, it evaporates quicker. One of the interesting things is, if you take ocean water, seawater, and you put it into a vessel, and then you put it in the sun, what will happen is that the water will evaporate and you'll be left with the salt. So this is the most common way of extracting salt in humanity. We do it all the time. We've been doing it for millennia. So there was a basic understanding that the water must have become vapor in the same way that when you heat it, it becomes vapor. And you could do the same thing. You can do it quickly by just heating the ocean water, the sea water, and you're left with the resin, which is basically salt. And you watch the water evaporating, becoming mist. And so they saw that this mist goes up, and they realized that this vapor and mist become clouds. And then, for whatever the reason, that wasn't 100% clear, but I don't think it's absolutely clear yet today, the water falls down in the form of precipitation. But that's not the end of the cycle. When the water falls down on the ground, you can collect some of it. Rainwater is not the cleanest water. It's okay, but it's not, you can drink it, but it's not the cleanest water. Rather, what happens is that you can watch and see that the water percolates into the ground, into the earth. And then it must travel, because suddenly, and especially you see this on mountains, that the water that collects on the top emerges as springs and as wells that you can dig further away. Now, if you really get into it, and you can see this near the shore, in rocky areas, and where there are caves, you can come to the conclusion that the water underground is actually moving. We call these aquifers, where it's collected, but then these aquifers also are connected to one another. So there's underground rivers. And this is all well known. This has been known for centuries and millennia. So we have this interesting water cycle where finally the water that emerges after it was in the ground is the cleanest, the spring water. So we've taken the water from the ocean, which is the biggest collection of water on Earth, quite clearly. It evaporates and becomes clouds and then precipitation, which is cleaner, but not completely clean. And then after it percolates and flows through the earth, it emerges as spring water, which is the cleanest, the water that comes from wells, which is clean and fresh. So this water cycle is one of the most important metaphors, allegories used in the psychological understanding of Torah and how Torah functions. Now, I made a certain leap here. The leap is very simple, that the sages constantly liken the Torah to water. They say the Torah acts like water, but they don't just mean Torah in the sense of what's inside the Chumash. They mean any kind of knowledge, any kind of information or change in attitude that a person receives from and through his mind. That is likened to water. So the beliefs that we have, the ideals that we hold, the knowledge that we possess, all these things are like Torah. They're parts of the Torah, parts of any kind of instruction that we might receive, applied knowledge, and so on. And it all works like water. And when we say that it works like water, what we're saying is that it functions the way that the water cycle functions. Now, this is very important. What do we mean by it functions like the water cycle? Where are we in this water cycle? What's going on here? So the understanding is that there is water that comes from above. That's like what we call the teachings of a prophet. Water that comes from above is like water that comes from an authority. Right? So these are like the clouds bringing down precipitation. Moses talking to the people, teaching them the ways of God, is like rain coming down from the heavens. Where did this rain originate? It originates in the ocean. In the biggest body of water, which we didn't mention before, but in the end, even the underground rivers flow to this biggest of storage areas of water on Earth. Here on this picture that I have here, you can see the measures. The ocean contains 1,335,000 cubic kilometers of water. In the atmosphere, there's only 12.7 kilometers of water. In the groundwater, the water that's underneath the earth, there's 15,300, a factor of 100 less than what there is in the ocean, but a factor of 1,000 more than what there is in the atmosphere. So we're going to look at these numbers in a moment and see what they mean. But the idea here is that the prophet, the one who's the authority, is receiving his knowledge from the great ocean of water. The great ocean of water can be thought of as God's thought, as what God thinks. It's orders of magnitude greater than even what the greatest prophet can understand, because the prophet is like receiving it from the atmosphere. How the water gets from the ocean to the atmosphere, we're not going to discuss right now, but in Chassidus, the explanation is that it gets there because we do mitzvos. That's kind of circular logic, because before you received knowledge from the prophet, how did you know that there was a mitzvah? How did you know there was a commandment, something that God wanted you to do? Well, you knew because in the same way that Abraham knew without receiving prophecy yet about a mitzvah, meaning many of the commandments are natural to man. Not all of them are beyond our natural inclination. Like, for instance, being charitable is something that is natural to us. Perhaps praying is something that's natural to us. So many things that we do, even though they're not a commandment, we would do them anyway. So these things are actually what we call it, that they give God, as it were, the motivation to teach us more, because we act a certain way. It's sort of like when you see a child who's already awakening to becoming older, and based on their actions, based on their behavior, you decide that it's time to teach them more. So in that sense, the prophet receives from the atmosphere. He receives the water that's coming down as precipitation from the clouds. I mean, now it's very common to make that joke that Moses was the first one to download something from the cloud, right? So all prophets do that. They all receive that. It's a great metaphor. It's not stam. It's not an empty metaphor. It's exactly the metaphor that's used in Kabbalah and Chassidus. So the prophet brings down knowledge as an authority from the cloud. He downloads it. And he brings it down as it can be drunk. You can drink rainwater, but something is missing. It's not fresh, clean water yet. It's not fresh and clean enough because it hasn't gone through mundane reality. It hasn't met the earth. It hasn't percolated through the earth, which cleans it up. In other words, Torah, as it was taught to the prophets, is not yet applicable. It's not yet turned into something that you can apply in day-to-day life. That happens through using it and thinking about it and meditating upon it. What the sages did. The sages took the Torah taught by Moses, the Torah taught by the prophets, and they passed it through the great earth here, the great earth, which is the mind, the human mind and the application. They turned it into something that was meant to change reality. That's the percolation of these rainwaters, the words of the prophets, into the earth. And once they enter into the earth, once they become something that's applied, once they began to transform even what Abraham had learned from himself, even these natural tendencies to do good deeds, and they teach you the depth of it. And they teach you that sometimes it's not the way you thought it was naturally. This percolation, this movement through the earth, this movement through the application cleans it up, meaning it makes it pure and fresh for human consumption. What does that mean? It means that if somebody comes today to learn Torah from the prophets, he doesn't understand it fully. It can't fully be integrated. As opposed to the Torah, the way it's taught by the sages, who already had the waters passing through the earth, meaning applied in day-to-day life. So that's why most of the time what we learn Talmud. We learn what the sages said. Why? Because they took these teachings from the prophets and they cleaned them in the sense that they made them consumable by every person. Every person would feel that this is clean water, as opposed to rainwater, which is not for everybody. And all the more so, ocean waters, which are not at all for anybody, only for maybe one person, for Moses. In fact, it says that when he was taken out of the waters, the meaning was that he was taken out of the primordial waters, the ocean, this abyss, this ocean that contains all the knowledge of God. He was taken out of that. Okay, so now we have this in place. We can begin to understand what was going on here. The whole story, again, this is not to say for a moment that this didn't happen. We're just looking at it from the psychological aspect. The generation that came out of Egypt was a generation whose heart, who was closed, whose heart wasn't open, whose mind wasn't open to the teachings that Moses had for them. Meaning to give them water, to bring water out of the rock, Moses had to strike the rock with his staff. It was a difficult process. There are people that were enslaved, but more importantly than enslaved physically, they were enslaved spiritually. And the water couldn't yet affect them. The Torah couldn't yet affect them. It couldn't yet integrate so easily into them. When a person is hard-headed, it's really a sign that they're hard-hearted, that their heart is hard. The heart is what allows the mind to open up. And so we all know that if you have a teacher that you really love, it's very easy to listen and to learn from them. When somebody wins you over in terms of their personality and your heart opens up to them, it's much easier to understand things that they teach. But it's much more than that. Having a hardened heart, it's called a heart of stone in the Bible, means that the person feels prideful, means that they have a strong sense that they already know things. And it's very hard to teach them something new. So the hard heart has to be broken in a sense. It has to be shattered. And that's exactly, there's a saying from Reb Nachman, for instance, there's nothing more whole than a broken heart. Why a broken heart? So a lot of times this is understood as after you suffer enough in the world, you become open to hearing great things. But the truth is that the suffering is not what opens you up to hearing great things. The suffering is what makes you doubt that you have all the truth. It makes you want to hear new things. It's not that the breaking of the heart is what opens the mind. It's just that when the heart is broken, the person is more willing to listen to other words of wisdom. I think I've mentioned this before, that one of the greatest changes that happened to me when I met Chassidus, when I met the teachings of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, was to understand that as opposed to the way I'd been brought up, when somebody is broken, that's the time to teach them Torah. I was brought up with a different idea, that somehow it's not fair to take advantage, as it were, right? Advantage of a person being broken and using their weakness to convince them of Torah. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe, one of the first things I learned from him was that that's the greatest loving kindness you can do to a person who's broken. It's not that there's some kind of competition in life, whether you're going to know, I have to convince as many people as possible to know Torah. That's not what Torah is about. Torah is the greatest good that I can do for somebody because it's what's going to help them get through life. It's going to help them live life the right way. So when a person is broken and they're willing to listen because they suddenly feel that they don't have all the answers, the greatest loving kindness is to teach them Torah at that time. So getting back to this, the generation that came out of Egypt was closed-minded. They had to have their heart opened. And the rock symbolizes, in this case, the rock that has to be opened. It wasn't a sieve. It wasn't open. It wasn't porous. Their hearts were closed. So Moses had to strike it. But then something amazing happened. They began to open their minds. They began to open their hearts. And all that was needed for them to learn more, and that's what this whole story, fantastic. Here we're definitely dealing with a metaphor, there's no question, because it's in the Medrash, it's not the Pshat, it's not the literal meaning of what the Torah says. The story about the well coming up and the princes of the tribes taking their staffs and marking where the water would flow, that's definitely a metaphor for teaching, for the educational effort that was going on in the desert, in the wilderness, in those years, to teach the people Torah. Beautifully, the way that the mind was opened from now on, because everybody's mind before we start, when you come to this class, I make the same mistake every week, right? I said a while ago that every class should start with a nigun, with a song. Why? Because that's what opens the heart, that's what opens the mind. And that's exactly what they did. Every time they started a class, every time they brought water up, and here we're talking about water that's going to be applied. That's why it's coming up from the well. It's not coming down. The princes are not prophets. They're not Moses. They're taking what Moses has taught and they're applying it. So they began each lesson, each lecture, each day, whatever it was, with the song of the well. Which means that I should probably do what I said I would do. maybe now, better late than never. One of the most beautiful nigunim from the Rebbe is called the Shamil. The Shamil literally means king in Chechnya, in Chechnya. And this is a song. People mistake these types of melodies for sad melodies. They're not sad melodies, they're melodies of yearning. He was captured and he was put in a jail cell. And he composed this song, this melody, and is yearning to be free again. That's exactly what the soul yearns for, the freedom of Torah. So we'll sing just a couple of minutes of it, and then we'll continue. Ya 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 ma ma ya ma Ayama ma yama ma ayamam ayama ma yama ma ayama ma yama ma ayama ma yam ayama ma yama ma ayama yama ayama ma yama ma ayama yama hey ayama ma yama ma yama ma yama oh mama yamam hey hey yamam mama yamam mama. Okay, you can think you're supposed to think of 3 times, but we don't have time. We have to continue. At the end of 40 years, after Miriam died, the well disappeared. They learned now that it had been in her merit. So God says to Moses, bring it back. And Moses goes and does exactly what he did to the generation that was alive 40 years ago. But remember, none of those people is alive any longer. They've all passed away. This is the new generation. Who are these people that he's now calling rebellious? They're the children. They were raised by Moses. They didn't know anything else. They weren't in Egypt, or even if they were in Egypt, they're too young to remember it. Their whole mind, their whole conceptual view of reality has been changed by Torah. They see the world a different way. They see the world the way that Moses taught them. And yet Moses doesn't understand. And he strikes the rock, and he calls them rebellious, and he strikes the rock as if they need the same type of treatment that the generation that came out of Egypt needs. That told God that for all his greatness, Moses can't lead them into the land of Israel. He doesn't speak the language. He doesn't understand the heart of this new generation, even though he brought them up. In other words, he doesn't trust them. He calls them rebellious because he doesn't trust them. Now, there's a lot to be said about this. We don't have so much time to say about it. But the first thing I want to say about it is that this is a lesson for every parent. Every parent has to understand this lesson that appears in this parsha. The lesson is very simple. If you brought this child up, you should have faith in them. You should trust them. They look rebellious. They seem to you to be doing things against what you taught them. It's not necessarily the case. It just seems to you that way. Why? Because they maybe are too young to understand how to apply what you've taught. And instead, what they're doing is they're looking at the abstract meaning of what you taught them and idealizing it. Young people function by ideals. Young people are not practical enough to understand that ideals need to percolate through reality until they become suitable to drink by every person. Ideals are like the water that comes down from the heavens, the rainwater, the precipitation. Ideals are something else. But young people, that's what they understand. So they understand the essence of what was said, but they don't yet know how to apply it in the right way. That takes years to figure out. How many years? Probably 40 years. That's what the sages say, that it takes 40 years for a person to understand the thought of his teacher. Why does it take 40 years? The reason is because you can understand what the teacher said right away, but you haven't taken it through life. You haven't taken it through real situations. You understand it ideally, you understand it abstractly, and because of that, you can't apply it the right way yet. But it takes a tremendous amount of faith to know that the person who was your student, your child, whoever it is, will eventually do it the right way. You should have faith in them. It's just going to take time. Every person takes a different amount of time to percolate through reality, to take these teachings that they've learned and percolate them through reality. So Lana asks an amazing question. Why don't we start off learning or teaching Kabbalah and eventually Halacha? Who said we don't? On the contrary. The thing that children understand is they understand ideal language. I remember that Rav Steinsaltz once told me more than once, more than on one occasion. I just never heard the song. I know that he didn't compose it, somebody else did. He told me that when his children were 3 and 4 years old, he had them singing about the Sfirot, the 10 Sfirot. That's that. He said, children understand God ideally, much better than we do. Because for us, God has to be a practical application of something. And we have all these questions and problems. Right away, we have this problem. Why is there evil? Why is there this? Why is that? Children just accept it. They understand the ideal meaning behind things much better than adults do, the abstract meaning. What they have a difficult time with is how to apply it. And so we teach a lot of halacha, because halacha, that's also, by the way, why children don't connect to halacha. Most people don't. They don't connect to halacha. Most people, if they're taught in a frum environment, so the ones who are very submissive and good-natured, so they accept that this is how we do things. But the ones who are a little bit more idealistic and abstract are constantly arguing. And at some level, they could be arguing at the level of, I don't want to do this at all. They could be arguing at the level of, why do you have to do it this way? Maybe you can do it a different way. That's how human nature is. We start with the abstract and we slowly learn to apply it. So we heard what Moses had to say for 40 years. But interestingly, Moses doesn't believe in the people that he taught. The older ones were already 60 years old. And they couldn't wait to get into the land of Israel and apply all of this. But Moses saw them as rebellious. The moment they asked for water in the way that they asked, which would mean, you haven't taught us yet. So that's what they're asking for. They're asking for water. There's no more water. Where are the teachings? Moses says you're rebellious. There's been teachings all the time. Why are you not listening? The problem is with your heart. We have to break your heart again. But no, they've been listening for 40 years. What are they saying? Maybe they're saying, as we enter the land of Israel, we want to hear more. We want to hear something deeper. We're ready to apply new things that we couldn't apply out here in the desert. And we know that that's exactly what happened. The whole book of Deuteronomy, which is coming up in a few weeks, is exactly those new teachings that Moses couldn't teach until then. They were right. They wanted new waters. They wanted new teachings, and they received them in the end. Because God told Moses, this is what you have to do. Except that perhaps the book of Deuteronomy, if Moses would not have struck the rock, perhaps that book would have been given directly as what we saw as precipitation coming from above from God. Instead, it came as something in the middle, with Moses saying it and God sounding off at the end. But they were right. What could Moses have done? He could have not struck the rock. He could have sung to it. He could have spoken to it. What do you do with a rebellious child? You have to speak. You have to speak until you turn blue. But not out of anger, not out of a feeling that you're being betrayed, not out of a sense of discipline, but out of explanation. This is how I understand these teachings. I learned this too when I was your age. And it took me a long time to understand it the way I understand it now. It took me a long time to learn how to apply it. And this doesn't have to be Torah. It can be anything that an adult understands and that an adolescent, a young person, understands ideally. And by the way, I said before in the beginning, adolescence can be at any age. Because if I'm, for instance, learning how to work as a mechanic in a car shop, I also in the beginning understand things ideally and slowly pick up on the fact that there's no ideal parts. And once the engine has been running for 100,000 kilometers or 100,000 miles, the parts are not as well defined as they used to be. And you have to work a little to get things out, and they don't look the same way as when you put them in, and everything changes. And working in a non-ideal setting in the real world is different than the way I understood things ideally when I was just taking the classes. So there's an amazing thing when you look at the verses. Moses calls them rebellious, and yet they didn't say anything that was rebellion. It wasn't like the first time. The first time, if you remember in Exodus, it said, soon they will be stoning me. They were threatening him. You took us out of Egypt, and you promised us a whole new world, and even teachings you don't have, all the more so water. But here they weren't threatening him. But Moses saw the same thing that he had seen 40 years ago, and he couldn't tell the difference. So God says to him, you're not the right person to take them in. The person who's going to take them in has to be somebody who likes, who wants what we call rebellion, who understands that rebellion is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Why? Because rebellion means you're taking the ideal seriously. And you're rebelling against the way it's applied right now. The older people, they apply the ideal in a way that doesn't make sense to the younger people. It just simply doesn't make sense. So they rebel against it. The only thing you can't rebel against is God. But you should rebel against everything else. Otherwise, you're not on a path to fully integrating and understanding it. So when a child rebels, it's actually a positive thing. It means that the ideal is there and it's working. it's just going to take time to sift through, to percolate through reality until they eventually learn how to apply it the right way. It's an amazing thing that Rav Ginsburg points out, that the very first time that the word rebellion appears in the Torah is in the introduction to the war of the 4 kings and the 5 kings that Abraham took part of, or in the aftermath of, took part. And there it says that for 12 years they served the 5 kings, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the other 3 cities of the prairie. They served the kings from the 4 kings from the east. And then it says, in the 13th year they rebelled. What's in the 13th year they rebelled? So he says beautifully, this is a beautiful allusion to the fact that rebellion from a child begins when they turn bar mitzvah. An incredible idea. The purpose of Torah is to make a person into a rebel, the same way that Abraham was. Abraham was a lifelong rebel. Everybody said one thing and he said the opposite. Rebellion is not negative. Rebellion means pursuing an ideal. You have to be practical too. But everything has to be rebelled against, because the only truth is the truth that comes from God. And any kind of application that was created by man is subject to revision, it's subject to improvement, it's subject to change. Science, you need to rebel against. You don't have to believe evolution if you don't want to. You don't have to believe quantum mechanics if you don't want to. I know most of the people in the world would say that's a foolish thing to do. But the great revolutions in science happened because there were people who said exactly that. The only thing you can't rebel against is God. And that's what it says in our Parsha, Ach b'Hashem al timrodu. Only against God do not rebel. It literally means that. That even when you're learning Torah, there is an element of truth in every rebellion. That when somebody comes and says, I don't accept how you understand this verse, so it requires you to go back and reconsider it and rethink about it and try to understand how to put it together the right way so that they understand it also. Okay, so there's a lot more to be said about this, but this is an important point to, especially for parents. And I happen to have seen a number of parents last week with problems with their children. We had long discussions. And in the end, to solve all these problems requires a great deal of faith. Faith in yourself and faith in your children. You have to believe that what you taught has been heard. And if it hasn't, the only way to work to make sure that it is to continue to talk, but not to break. Breaking doesn't help. And all these different approaches of trying to discipline after the age of 13, 14, they don't really work. It doesn't mean that you have to agree to everything. You don't have to agree, but you have to explain. And the more you explain, the more you're willing to accept the fact that rebellion is actually an ideal interpretation of what you yourself taught, then it becomes easier to deal with it and easier to see how to approach it in explaining how to apply these ideals in the right way.